So good morning and welcome to the webinar devoted to the topic of Ukrainian trade and investment liberalization, and in particular association agreement of Ukraine with the European Union. We have today with us presenter Veronika Movchan. She is a director of the Institute for International Research and Policy Consulting in Kiev. It's one of the major think tanks in Ukraine that focuses on economic and social research. They also do policy consulting and have quite a number of projects in support of civil society in Ukraine. So she will present the results of the study the Institute did in cooperation with several stakeholders. And I will not spend too much time talking about it. I will just only point out that this association agreement with the EU, it's of an unprecedented scale for Ukraine. It's the main tool for bringing EU and Ukraine closer together in economic terms. It has been already for several years in power. There have been some big developments in terms of regulatory changes in Ukraine, in terms of changing trade patterns. The EU became a much more important export destination for Ukraine in the wake of the DCFTA exception. And there has been already a number of studies looking at the first possible effects of the DCFTA on the Ukrainian economy. The results have been quite mixed of those studies, so there hasn't been really a definite conclusion how beneficial the agreement was for the Ukrainian economy. But here I think it's very important to make an analysis of what actually has been at stake, what has been negotiated and what has been implemented so far, and what are the prospects for further implementation of regulatory changes in Ukraine. Because in order to assess all the possible consequences, one needs to properly understand the scale of changes happening. And what Veronika and her colleagues made, it's a very detailed assessment of this process. And please, Veronika, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Olga, thank you very much. And thank you all colleagues who joined us today. It's my great pleasure to present. It's a joint study done together with several other think tanks, including Dixie Group, who is the major, they collected major specialists on energy policy, and also we cooperated with Research and Analysis Center, Society and Environment, who are dealing with energy, with ecology, first of all, with Green Deal now. And our institute specializes on economic policy. And the whole study was funded by International Renaissance Foundation, one of the institutions in the network of open society institutions funded by the George Soros Foundation. And I will now show the presentation. I hope it works. Yes, it seems it did. So basically, what we did in this study, what was the question for this study? That was to understand how the implementation of association agreement progresses, what should be done, and with a focus on, first of all, sectoral implementation. Before we go into the study, I want to remind you a bit about the chronology of the whole association agreement, because we are now in the end of 2021. But the whole process actually started in 2007. Then the association agreement talks launched. Then it was not the title association agreement, but that was then the negotiations began. And in 2008, actually, the talks about DCFTA, or then it was called FTA Plus, started after Ukraine joined the WTO. The whole agreement, whole text was agreed in 2011. So basically more than 10 years ago. In 2012, it was initialed. Then we had a dramatic event of 2013. Then the agreement was not signed, and it took actually a revolution to come to the end of this preparatory phase and the negotiation and completion of the agreement by its signature and then the ratification by the parliaments in order to allow them the most part of the agreement to start provisional application 2014. So 14 can be considered as a benchmark for almost the beginning of the implementation, although it took also a year and a half of trilateral consultations with Russia before it was finally then DCFTA, Deep and Comprehensive Free Trade Area, formally began to work. We are now at the phase then Ukraine already started gradual updating together with the EU, natural updating of annexes, because the agreement, it's a huge document, 2,000 pages with over 300 regulations, EU directives and regulations explicitly named. And it's clear that since 2011, then the talks were concluded, the agreement, the EU regulations changed. For example, one of the very clear examples is financial sector regulations after the crisis of 2008, 2009. The EU completely revised the financial regulatory architecture, and the agreement still contains the old version, while approximation efforts are based on the new ones. But it's not only these cases. We have the same situation, for example, digital union or digital single market. The whole idea of that emerged after talks were completed and the agreement entered into operational sphere. So we have the issue of updating and upgrading the agreement, but basically we also have the issue of like its modernization because of new challenges are emerging. In 2021, in October, that was the 24th EU-Ukraine summit. It's the highest political event in bilateral work of EU and Ukraine, and this summit formally confirmed the beginning of the comprehensive overview of the agreement. Actually, it was launched, this overview was announced already at the beginning of 2021, because it's in accordance with the article of the agreement that after 5 years, the parties can comprehensively assess what was done and how to progress further. And this summit reconfirmed that, as well as it confirmed that several annexes were upgraded. So this is agreement, this is the process, the process that started for some time already. And Ukraine and EU are now in a quite active phase of changes. If we look at their economic integration, which is one of the core elements of the association agreement, we can tentatively, I highlight tentatively, split all arrangements in 3 categories. Some arrangements, they have a direct action. For example, abolition of import duties for most of goods, or introduction of TRQs instead of MFN import duties. So duty-free to some extent, and then usual MFN. There is no intervention needed or no additional efforts needed unless we want to change the conditions. Ukraine and the EU have already changed the conditions for Ukraine's export of poultry to EU because it was a very strong growth of exports using the more incomprehensive coverage of TRQ of poultry. And then the TRQ was expanded in terms of codes and in terms of the size. But now Ukraine and the EU started consultations of further liberalization and further TRQ. But that is like, it's a change of Ukraine. It's in addition of what has been already. But there is a lot of agreements that we have then, if then clause, I'm sorry, it's a typo here. If that means that the implementation of such commitments requires that Ukraine does its regulatory approximation or institutional approximation, and then it opens the opportunity for deeper integration. One of the most typical examples is the conclusion on agreement on conformity assessment and acceptance of industrial products, so-called ACAA agreement. Here, the cooperation between EU and Ukraine is crucial, because if Ukraine does something wrong at the beginning, for example, doesn't transpose the legislation in full aligned with the EU legislation, and then it starts building on secondary legislation and institutions on these like wrong fundamental. And then EU verifies it at a later stage, it creates a problem that you have to return to the beginning. It's completely inefficient and time consuming, and regretfully, in some cases, we have already observed that over these 7 years of the association agreement implementation. That's why we recommend that EU and Ukraine work closely, and we now see more and more of these issues showing up. And the third type of arrangements in economic sphere are so-called arrangements that contribute to the creation of level playing field for fair competition between Ukraine and EU companies. That concerns competition policy, state aid, intellectual property rights protection, and consumer protection, many spheres where the alignment of legislation would not cause the immediate opening of the market, additional opening. But it is very important for smooth functioning of the whole architecture. We will, in this study that we did, we focused on this second part, if-then arrangements. Then EU and Ukraine cooperate jointly, but then it gives an integration, either it's internal market treatment or it's a mutual recognition, but basically it's a close integration in the EU internal market. And basically these arrangements are the arrangements that are expected to bring the major gains. If we are talking about benefits and losses of DCFTA, that was not the focus of this study, but Olga already mentioned that, and it's important to highlight that. We have like 2 layers of, or 3 layers of impact. One layer is from these direct changes, mutual removal of tariff protection. And what we see now, to a large extent, is a result of this removal. If we look at the trade dynamics, we observe that after Ukrainian crisis slowed down, because we had not only the signature of association agreement and DCFTA, we got a war and we got a deep economic crisis because of and political crisis after like a fast change of the governance. And it appeared that Ukrainian economy was, put it mildly, not very reformed. There's a lot of flaws and pervasive corruption. So after Ukraine survived the first crisis, and recovery started in 2015 and especially 16, we saw a boom of exports to EU, and that was largely thanks to the elimination of barriers. It was not thanks to the removal of non-tariff barriers, because they are still to show up, this removal. In many cases, there are some positive things, but major changes are still or many changes are still to come, or they are entering slowly, so we do not feel them fully yet. So that's why what we see now is economic gains. It's just the beginning of everything promised. The studies that I did almost 10 years ago with a computable general equilibrium model of what would be the major gains, actually they showed that non-tariff barriers removal is a major game changer, not elimination of import duties. While currently what we already see in the economy is mostly the removal of import duties plus some first results of reduction of non-tariff barriers. So more to come. And now it's how we can get this more to come is that we remove non-tariff barriers and achieve deeper integration in these sectoral things that we studied in depth with our colleagues during 2020. We identified 15 areas in which Ukraine has to implement commitments and the EU has to make a decision allowing deeper integration. Technical barriers to trade, this is DCFTA, sanitary measures, food safety that can be resolved with a recognition of equivalence. Then it's customs procedures. Here we talk about, for example, common transit system or mutual recognition of authorized economic operators, financial services, internal market treatment is promised, postal courier services, the same, telecommunication services, the same internal market treatment. Plus we have transport, where we have either internal market treatment or separate agreement or possibility to conclude a separate agreement. Energy, where the integration is going through energy community, public procurement, mutual access, education, mutual recognition of qualification. If everything is implemented, it will give Ukraine quite extraordinary access to the European internal market. And the question is, and according to the schedules that we have in the agreement, that should have been happening right almost now, or definitely by 2023, which is in a year almost. We are not in this position yet, and it's partially it's the Ukrainian fault, slow reforms, but it's also this issue of lack of mechanism of verification that the resource, because resources needed for that, they have to be provided in the EU, and it's also a task. So far, tangible results were achieved only in 3 areas. In SPS, that is recognition of equivalence for seeds, for grain seeds. In natural gas, that is the alignment to the third energy package and the transformation of Naftogaz, allowing to conclude a new transit agreement with Gazprom under completely new rules. And very recently, the conclusion of Common Aviation Area Agreement. I will talk very briefly about a couple of these areas where Ukraine can implement, just to give you a feeling what's happening. But I want to focus on what is to expect, and more importantly, what has to be done to achieve that. Because the discussion of gains should be based on what was done, and then it is done, then we can see whether it gave a result. Because time is passing and it's feeling that everything has to be done already, but it is not, basically. And partially because the agreement was quite ambitious, probably, I would not say that it was more ambitious than needed. It was rightly ambitious, but timeline and resources needed for implementing was probably not well thought through. Or maybe we have other additional shocks that was not expected, like definitely not expected revolution, definitely not expected war, but also some new challenges like climate change, newly recognized challenges, or new opportunities like digital and single market. Then what are the areas in which I wanted to talk? It's one is a technical barriers to trade. This is a conclusion of CAA. Why it's important? It was a big debate before, like it was widely recognized that it's important, and it's not only the reduction of trade costs, because the ACA, it's a recognition of conformity assessment certificates, conformity assessment procedures of partners. Basically, part of the reduction of trade costs happened because of harmonization. But the recognition of this same regulation and recognition of the procedures of verification is another dimension that is still to come, hopefully, in a couple of years. It gives faster placement of new products, easy access for smaller firms, but it also ensures higher safety and better variety of the market. Plus, it gives opportunity to sell that as their additional positive feature of the product for third markets, because EU standards are like perceived, and they are, but it's not only existent, but it's perceived as better and stronger standards globally compared to Ukraine. Currently, Ukraine is in the expert assessment mission, second phase. The first phase about legislation was quite successful, but now the institution has to be assessed. And this ACA will be only for a couple of product categories, and we'll see this story for years and years to come. Another important dimension is transport. Here's one of the most, I would say, challenging issues, because we have some clear-cut integration promises like air transportation, common aviation area agreement that was signed. It's not really asymmetric, it's a bit asymmetric in terms of providing Ukraine slightly less rights than European companies, but let us implement what we have at least now. But they have internal market treatment promise for international maritime transportation, but for the other three types, including domestic, river, rail, and the special road, is only a possibility of concluding special agreements. Why for Ukraine? These special agreements are crucial, especially for roads, because Ukraine has now quite a big challenge to transit goods through Poland due to deficit of transit permits, which are regulated at the level of the European Union. On the positive side, Ukraine and the EU signed CAA, Common Aviation Space Agreement, was signed in October this year, and Ukraine has been progressing in some legislation, especially about domestic transportation. But frankly, Ukraine is also legally lagging behind. In energy, it's a very high topic. What was done? It's mostly in a gas sphere, and in a gas sphere we have this conclusion of new agreement. This Gazprom that became possible by establishment of independent operator of gas transmission, the unbundling of Naftogaz, and the complete change of the whole market architecture. Now we are coming to the next issue in electricity, and the SOE network joining the electricity grids of European Union, which is not easy. Ukraine is not operating autonomously as of now. Ukraine started importing electricity from Belarus recently on the winter crisis forthcoming. But the independent autonomous operation was planned for next year, so we'll see. Ukraine is actually still preparing to conclude NTSE with the European Union join NTSE soon. So we see that it's happening. Plus, we have a Green Deal. I would not stop here, just say that it's overlapping, but it's not identical. Ukraine is aiming to become a part of Green Deal, and we already see the integration, at least a conclusion of memorandums and joining to industrial alliances, the battery lines and raw material lines. So we will see how it will come. Ukraine did a very big commitments related to reduction of emissions of big combustion plants, or large combustion plants. So we'll see. But so far, the association agreement ambitions are not as ambitious as the Green Deal, but even these parts are not fully implemented.
Veronika, maybe before we proceed, there's been a couple of questions in the chat, which I think maybe would be more relevant at this stage of a presentation. First one is from Hannes Hofbauer, who asks, you speak of common markets. Association agreement opens the Ukrainian market for overproduced commodities from EU. Conversely, what products can Ukraine offer? Agricultural products from black soil, that's the question. But I think partly you kind of cover this talking about the Green Deal, but maybe you can, elaborate a bit more. I know that's not exactly the focus of your presentation, but I think talking about sectoral dimension, you really touch upon this aspect as well.
Yeah, thank you. But basically, then we are talking about association agreement. It covers goods, services, and partly mobility of professionals, and also it covers the capital mobility. It's not for freedoms, but it covers everything. What Ukraine can offer to the European market? Yeah, agricultural goods, definitely, but basically, if we look at the product variety of what Ukraine exports to the EU, it is almost everything. The country has quite, if I may answer technically, we have the trade nomenclature about 5,000 positions. It's HS 6-digit, harmonized system 6-digit. No country in the world exports all 5,000. It's just impossible because we have all our specialization. Average amount is about 3.5 or 4,500 varieties that each country exports. Ukraine exports about 4,000 varieties. To the EU, Ukraine ships 80% of what Ukraine ships somewhere in the world. So basically from small planes, because Ukraine now is developing the production of not only Antonov Mriya, which is a bit stagnant, a part of services, but also small planes that ship to you, to corn and maize. Yes, there is 8 products that they're in the top of the shipping list at the beginning of association agreement, and it still remains there. We have the corn, we have the sunflower oil, which is processed, but still it can be considered commodity. And it is ignition wiring sets. It's some cables for the cars, which is, we have a part of the value chain for production of cars in Ukraine, especially in Western Ukraine. There's more than dozens of factories servicing all major European car producers. But these are like top parts. But if we analyze the whole nomenclature, last year 49% of all products were processed products that shipped to you. It's changed this year a bit, it's 43 or something, because we see growth in metallurgy and semi-processed. The share of raw materials reduced from 33% to about 27-26%. This reduction happened already in 2016 or something, and this level stayed. So the structure, the raw materials is a part of the Ukrainian exports to the EU, but it's not major. We have both like semi-processed and processed, and the share of processed products has been growing with some fluctuations this year, thanks to nominal boom of nominal prices and boom in demand for metals in the EU, semi-processed. One more measure is if we look at the consumer products. Consumer products at the beginning of association agreement 2014, they accounted, I think, for 8% of total exports to EU. It's now 17%. Consumer products includes food, but it includes semi-durable goods like apparel, or it includes durable goods like, for example, household appliances, which are also quite actively shipped to the EU. Ukraine produces tea makers, coffee makers, washing machines. It's not visible. If you think about Ukraine, you think about maize because it's the largest. And also TRQs help, it's subject to TRQ. You discussed it, or poultry. But actually, it's not about only very few and very commodity type of things. Plus IT, Ukraine, if you look at the services, definitely transport is the largest part, but recently IT started to expand very actively. And we have also gradual expansion of services in trade. Also, definitely goods will dominate for a long time. Vienna, Georgia, for which services are more important.
Just a brief I think you answered very extensively. No, there is like a similar question, but they ask like about the effect of this direct effect of import duties evolution, in particular for SMEs, whether there have been some trends detected. The rest of the questions there so far are more strategic nature. I will keep them for the end, but this probably I can also mention if you have some, observation.
The role of SMEs in trade.
No, but the SMEs whether there have been any detectable effects for SMEs in particular from the DCFTA.
I think yes. Also, SMEs they I would say as they are smaller. If we look at their value in exports, I still did not do these calculations, but definitely they are not all experts. Also, for example, same ignition variances, which account for 7% of exports, they are partly SMEs, more M than S, than more medium than small. But more straightforward answer. There are about 14,000 enterprises currently exporting to EU from Ukraine. Altogether, the number of large enterprises in Ukraine is 500. So at least, even if we assume that all 500 large enterprises export to EU, we have 13,500 remain, that is SME. The number of exporters to EU increased. It was about 10,000 at the beginning, now it's 14. Number of large enterprises in Ukraine didn't change. So all who started exporting, they are small or medium. More likely they are medium than small because exports to any market is additional fixed costs, which are definitely much more burdensome for small enterprises than for larger ones, or at least medium size. But we know stories of we know a lot of stories from agriculture, just because, I don't know, it's most dense issue. It's a lot of rural population, it's a poorer people. So everybody, then you hear stories about agriculture. For example, exports of snails to EU from small farmers starting to ship that, or honey producers that are now trying to form some cooperatives or ship jointly, which makes it easier. Now they started to pack it also, not only bulk shipment. We have stories of apparel producers. And we are not accounting, for example, for even micro businesses that sell through platforms, online platforms, and we just cannot really trace them. And we are not talking about IT, which is all small, probably even individual. or even these small planes, airplanes about which I said before, it's not a large business, medium-sized business. So there is a lot of stories about small and medium-sized businesses penetrating new markets. Definitely, it's only a small share of all Ukrainian businesses because it's about 300,000 registered businesses. 99 and point something of them are small. And 2/3 of Ukrainian output are businesses. Definitely in exports, we don't have like one-to-one proportional representation. But I don't think that any country in the world can say that. Exports is expensive.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think it's a very detailed answer, and probably it's one more additional evidence towards justification of not that high cost of adjustment to regulation of the EU if the amount of SMEs who could do that is quite impressive. So probably things are moving in the right direction. At least we can cautiously be optimistic about it. But I think we should now continue with the presentation and keep the rest of the questions for the end.
With a pleasure. I tried to restart the presentation. We started. I will return to the Green Deal. Just one issue about reflection of the cost. The cost is not low for regulatory approximation, but it is. We cannot say that regulatory approximation started like in 2014. Ukraine has been the most expensive regulatory approximation is the technical barriers or sanitary phytosanitary barriers. But that has been changing for years before. For example, Ukraine first started to talk about ACAA, conclusion of ACAA in 2005 under Kuchma time frame. It's for people who follow the political development. So and Ukraine has announced that it's changing its system and approximating to EU even earlier. First major changes started in 2001. It took almost 20 years for the economy to reach the current level. So the regulatory approximation is costly, but if you take it slowly, you finally reach the end. That's a good news about that. But okay, and now if we return into the Green Deal and the presentation, we are entering as EU also entering a new round of serious regulatory approximations related to these climate issues. And here we might see a very important cost for all types of businesses, including SMEs, because Ukraine is quite energy inefficient. The production of our energy is still not very green to a large extent. And money available, funds available for this green transformation for Ukraine are much lower than the money available, for example, for the European Union business. But that's life. Okay, what we expect in our sectoral approximation in 2021-23, so it's in the near future. In principle, by 23, they're supposed to complete the integration, but we are not at such stage. It will take longer. You remember it was 15 areas and only in 2, and now after October in 3 we saw some movement. And here the list is clearly not all 15. It's short. What we got common aviation area agreement. It did not open markets immediately, but there are some opening started now and will be a couple more stages. We expect there will be mutual recognition of public procurement market, mutual access to public procurement markets, at least at couple stages. The verification mission is supposed to start sometime soon. We expect that Ukraine will access European common transit system, its customs. Ukraine has been piloting NTSE and NCTS, a new computerized transit system, for some time already, and is using it now in a parallel with national transit system. The conversion is expected hopefully in a year. And also mutual recognition of authorized economic operators could come soon. The connecting to NTSOE network would be good. So there are some concerns, but we are aiming 23. Conclusion of mutual recognition of electronic trust services, digital dimension. ACA as a framework agreement plus at least hopefully 3 areas covered. Further recognition of equivalence certification system for agri-food. Here we have a lot to do because we have only for seeds and we need it for all major products. So far, it's only the access for individual establishments, which is great, but insufficient. So the agenda is huge, and both Ukrainian and European political forces and the governments and authorities have things to do. For Ukraine, it's definitely a continuation of legislation harmonization, this cooperation, this close cooperation with European Union consultations that the draft regulations are in line with. A key that the verification that is, we need to prepare proper comparative tables. We need to verify that the translation is correct. Plus, we need to be ready to dynamic changes in the legislation in Ukraine with the change of the EU legislation, because Ukraine committed to dynamic approximation, at least for the areas that we are talking about, the areas where we want deep economic integration. Definitely, institutional reform should not be backsliding. Otherwise, it destroys not only where we are backsliding, but it destroys much wider areas of cooperation and continuous modernization of the Ukraine. In light with a new global agenda. It's not only Green Deal, it's also digital single market. It is transport union that is established by EU and Balkans, that energy union that is developing within the EU, because deeper integration in the European structures would give Ukraine closer. It will bring Ukraine closer to its ultimate strategic goal, but it also will allow implementing the key commitment of the association agreement, that is economic integration of Ukraine in the EU internal market. It is written in the association agreement, and it was reconfirmed as a mutual goal in the joint statement of the last summit. For EU, please work with Ukrainian authorities, with Ukraine on a daily or regular basis. Do not wait while Ukraine will do everything and to check, because as I said at the beginning, if something was then drawn at the beginning and then we are waiting for a couple of years before the correction starts, before the verification comes and the correction starts, we are losing time. We are already much in huge delay, for example, public procurement. The first verification should have come in a half a year after the launch of DCFTA. That is, we should have mutual access to at least some part of public procurement starting 17 or something. Still do not have that. We have that within the WTO agreement part, but it's not the same. Or ACA, Ukraine claimed the first round of legal harmonization already in early 15. And then only in 2020, we got a mission verifying what has been done. So please work at the draft regulation and then with verification of compliance. We have now very positive cases, for example, with the CAA, there is a regular joint working group between the Ukrainian and European authorities verifying what Ukraine does on a monthly basis. We have the annex of the association agreement, this energy annex 27, where the consultations at the level of draft legislation is in this. Please, it's for Ukraine and for you. Please do that. Modernization of agreement, as I said, and definitely Ukraine will need technical and financial support for implementation of this agreement and any further initiatives, especially Green Deal. How to do that? This is a huge question, but if it's done, then we will be able to say that yes, the agreement was implemented, and then we can see whether it was beneficial or not. To judge currently, it's not exactly the right time to do that. And plus fundamentals, we did not discuss that today, but on Ukraine side, to correct fundamentals like judiciary, and for EU side to support the correction of fundamentals remains the crucial framework for implementation of the whole deal. Thank you. That is my presentation, and we still have some time.
Thank you so much, Veronika. It's very educational and enlightening. Before I proceed with the questions from the audience, I wanted to ask you, so basically the process of implementation of the association agreement is still at the beginning, one might say. So it's a very small part has been done, and the harmonization appears to be like the moving target, because the regulation is constantly changing. Do you think what is the like most likely scenario? I mean, how high are the chances of Ukraine completing this at all, and then what possible time frame, or can it be modified, this process, because it doesn't sound too optimistic, the scale of progress so far and the amount of work which needs to be done, given the change, the dramatic change of the political regulatory landscape in the EU.
Thank you. That's a great question. I'm sorry for being not as optimistic. Actually, after I completed the study, I became more optimistic than I was before. In many areas, Ukraine did a lot, but the final steps has to be done jointly, or currently we need much deeper involvement in the EU. For example, technical regulation, where 27 spheres, multiple secondary legislation. Ukraine has largely completed legal approximation and established institutions. If we will see the results of the monitoring mission, the legal monitoring mission had recommendations. We don't have the conclusion that everything is ideal, but Ukraine, the changes that are still required are quite moderate, I would say small even. Institutional, we need to see the results of the mission, but all institutions in place, they are working. We'll see how to fine-tune them. The optimistic scenario that in 2023, the countries will start talks, that will be hopefully technical talks. So by the end of next year, we will understand whether Ukraine is ready to sign the framework NCA. And framework is the key, because it is all sectors will be annexes to the framework of NCA. If we sign the framework, then to add annexes will be easy. And that will be the conclusion of efforts that Ukraine take from 15 to 20 years, depending how to come. This customs, hopefully already next year, we will have a common transit and a mutual recognition. That will be like major step forward. It would mean that dynamic harmonization is forever. In this case, we are almost like a member states that have to adjust their legislation regularly, then EU adjusts. Ukraine joins the club in this case. The issue that Ukraine doesn't have any political voice for the discussion of legislation That will be another dimension of like modernization, that if we plan to implement it, we want to participate at least in the discussion. No voting rights, but at least some words to say. But at least now we can participate in consultations with business, with civil society, which is also important. But so legislation is a moving target, and there are areas, there are gaps. First largest gap is in transport. But as the situation with gas market, which is a huge thing, showed, everything is possible, and Ukraine can like complete that. I think that in couple years, hopefully we will say that Ukraine did a lot and covered maybe not all, but for example, we have significant progress and achievements in half of these sectoral integration. When Ukraine will be able to complete it? According to the agreement, the DCFTA has to be established in 10 years. 10 years means 2020 and 2025, basically 2026. I think by then, the major parts will be done. But it will mean that we have a new agenda, because this Green Deal will be just emerging, digital things will be ongoing, financial market. They're still looking at how Switzerland continues to have a common market with EU, because it's funny to say, but it's example, because in order to have internal market treatment for financial markets, according to the new European rules, you have to have authority of the European Central Bank, which is impossible in Ukraine as a sovereign independent state. So it should be some proxy. This proxy is now somehow developed in Switzerland. We will need to look closely at their experience to understand how to get. So not everything will be solved, but it's also not that never-ending story. It's a story with clear milestones to complete.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually, that sounds very optimistic. Now, I mean, if you talk in detail about the future prospects, layout, the schedule, yeah, maybe it's doable. There is a question about energy prices, since you talk about energy sector as one of the main sectors where has been already some progress. Are energy prices market prices in the meanwhile, and is there support for low-income population? I think it's kind of a sensitive question, I guess.
Yeah, it's a very sensitive question. A couple years ago, I would say that it was market prices. Recently, government stopped like this process of automatic adaptation. We have some deviations, but the new IMF agreement returns us to the path. We committed to return to the market prices. So we were there, we deviated a bit, they are returning. Yes, there is a support to low-income population. It's a system of subsidies, this simplified procedure, much more simplified procedure to get them, and also some important benchmarks to ensure that it's really targeted subsidies. It's not everybody receives them. The system always can be improved, but basically we have major elements, and if it deviates, we try to return it back. Politicians intervene.
Yeah, that's
unfortunately.
And another question is like more of geopolitical nature. So Ukraine, EU, it's just one vector of Ukraine international relations. But then there's US, and the question goes like, one can get an impression that the US leads the Ukraine on many political, security, defense, and economic issues. For example, Chart on Strategic Partnership from 2021 November, it's something very recent. And also China, Chinese economic engagement, and which influences economic cooperation of Ukraine with the EU and the USA, for example, state defense industry. So I think just a broad question about how does this DCFTA fit into the general Ukraine's international economic and political relations picture.
And it's extremely interesting question about, and yeah, it can take another hour for US and for US it's issue of security first of all, I would say. Yes, we have economic cooperation, but security cooperation is much more important. US and EU are our strategic partners, but in like issues of defense, I would say that US is ready to provide us with weapons for defense, and that is very important part of the whole cooperation. Ukraine is also actively cooperating with UK in the security and defense. Although we also close with EU, but it has absolutely different dimensions, security and defense in EU, because we have EU and NATO and how it's all thing works together. It's another topic, and I would not speak a lot here because I'm economist and I'm listening to colleagues more, and I would prefer not to talk myself here. On China, China is more economic so far, at least as far as I can say, and interestingly over last already 3 years, if we look at the trade structure, EU as a common customs territory is the number one. It's now 42% of Ukrainian trade in goods. But the second one is China. Since 2019, China is the second one, accounting for about 15% of Ukrainian trade, almost equally in exports and imports, and we have some trade deficit in trade with China. Actually, in 2019, it was expected that Poland will become the largest individual partner after Russia has been gradually declining. But China took over basically in exports, and China is large in imports as well. But if you look at the structure of trade with China, currently it's mostly commodities. It's 60% of exports, not trade, exports. Ukraine ships to China grains and iron ores. However, in imports, China is the largest supplier of equipment to Ukraine. It's larger than the European supply. Despite import duties, DCFTA, and etc. So yeah, China is trying to penetrate Ukraine. It doesn't have such level of penetration than EU does, definitely. But recently, the relations China is emerging as an issue for Ukraine, and Ukraine has to decide how to behave. For example, Ukraine wanted to sign something with Huawei, then it was officially cancelled, and again signed. So there are hesitations here, and we know the scandal, probably you heard the scandal with a sales of Motor Siege, largest engine producer for helicopters, for planes, to China. Then the deal was abolished, largely due to the pressure from US side, in particular, not only because Ukrainians and we don't also quite surprised. It's a private enterprise. It was sold strategic importance, but private enterprise. And now there is a very uncertain situation here. So yeah, China is the topic, emerging topic that will require additional studies and careful thinking.
But what about Belt and Road Initiative? I read that there are some already projects, smaller scale going on, but is there any government policy in this respect?
Ukraine is interested in that, but if you remember the map and One Belt, One Road Initiative, the major land road from China to EU goes through Russia, and then it goes through Belarus, because Ukraine-Russia relations are not so good, to put it mildly. So Ukraine has been developing the road through Trans-Caspian, Trans-Caucasus road through China, which is very interesting for Georgia, for Azerbaijan. Initially, it was under the, then we had problems, big problems crossing Russia. Initially, it was like very much advertised, but it was not very successful, but it seems to start working. Now we have container trade through this Trans-Caspian road. And it seems some road is also working through Russia, but basically Ukraine is not in the center of this Chinese initiative, because it's easier to go either to the north, or it's easier to go to the south, to, for example, Turkey or to the sea. So I would say that also it's a lot of enthusiasm. I don't see huge perspectives here, at least for now.
At least it means less controversy politically, but just probably to sum up, we haven't mentioned an elephant in the room, not a single time today. I mean, the pandemic, but probably there would be some repercussions from it also for the association agreement. What comes to my mind, there is a lot of talk now about potential for reshoring and nearshoring of European companies. And due to geographic location, Ukraine probably would be considered, as an attractive location to relocate. Do you think that this situation can be a catalyst for intensifying the association agreements process, the harmonization, or do you see any possibility of this happening at all?
It's also a lot of hope, but there are good reasons why Ukraine, yes, it's geographic proximity, it's now regulatory proximity, which is evolving the simplification of all these trade rules, customs, facilitation issues. But we have one fundamental issue that is related not only to issues of reshoring, but investment in general. This is the quality of rule of law and the protection of property rights. If Ukraine managed to move quickly in its judicial reform, which is in the next round of attempt, then yes, I see the opportunity. Given that this reshoring really occurs, because what I read recently, that actually only about 12% or 15% of enterprises are really serious about that. But if Ukraine does not move fast and does not do judicial reform, so the investment climate in general remains not very effective, all our trade efforts or reshoring efforts or education efforts might be lost. So we will see. Ukraine has things to do in any case. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I think we are right on time. It was very intense and very informative, and I'd like to thank you for the presentation and answering questions which do not only touch upon the subject, but in a broader sense. I think it's very interesting to have this exchange, and yeah, hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, and I apologize, we did not answer all questions. I don't know.
There is now a last small question about, since China is very present in Georgia, where will the port be for China and Ukraine in order for to conquer the region economically? I don't know whether you want to tackle that, or it's probably
China. Because I would not say that China is extremely present in Georgia. Georgia has FTA with China, that's true. But other than that, Georgia is very diversified in this case. Whether Ukraine can be port for China, China is developed, we're trying to find its way in Ukraine, and Ukraine is trying to find its way with China, given the strategic partnership with US and EU. How it will develop eventually, we will see. I cannot say no.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think as with many topics dealing with Ukraine, uncertainty is always a part of the equation, and still we try to get us informed as much as we can about what's going on, and it was very much helpful to have your presentation and to listen to the results of the study. So thank you again, and
Thank you.
till the next time.
Yeah, with pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye. Have a nice day.
You too.